Good evening and welcome. Mon nom est Ingrid Bachmann, je suis professeure dans le département des arts plastiques à l'Université de Concordia. Il me fait énormément plaisir de vous accueillir ce soir dans la série d'artistes invités à conversation en art contemporain, une série bimensuelle et des conférences dans le cadre du département des arts plastiques. Et j'espère vous compter parmi nous pour les prochaines conférences. My name is Ingrid Bachmann. I'm a professor in the MFA in Studio Arts department here at Concordia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's lecture in the Conversation Contemporary Art series, a bi-monthly series sponsored by the MFA in Studio Arts department at Concordia University, and we hope to include you in the following, hope you'll join us in the following lectures. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce Stephen Schofield, an artist whose work I've admired and known for many, many years. The materials, process, and subject of Schofield's work, sculpture, drawings, and performances, draw from laboratories, the private spaces of the home, the kitchen, the bathroom, and the garden. He has presented his work nationally and internationally, including his work at the Power Plant in Toronto, le Musée d'Art Contemporain, la Biennale de Montréal, le Musée National des Beaux-Arts de Québec, and so on and so on and so on. So I will let Stephen maybe tell you about some of his other achievements. In 2012, he presented new work at the Q Foundation in New York, and he recently won the public art competition for the Quartier des Spectacles in Montreal, which will be, I think, installed in September 2014. So I'd also like to welcome all of you to a reception afterwards in 407, where you have a chance to celebrate the lecture and maybe continue our conversation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephen Schofield.
Well, thank you. I'm actually quite touched by the invitation, and I decided before I actually get to the talk, I found two images that I kind of wanted to offer back to Ingrid. Ingrid and I had taught for, well, don't worry, relax, oh my God. I taught for a year and a half here with Ingrid and Barbara Lane and Trevor Gould and Thérèse Chabot. And it was an intense period in the master's program, and I found two images that are that Ingrid might remember. I was preparing a set of glass pieces for the Musée d'Art Contemporain in an exhibition, and because I had just been living in New York, I didn't actually have a studio. I was actually living in François Morelli's studio, but he also needed his studio, so I was also working in the Overdale building for the master's students off an office. So I had the glass sheets across the office door, and Lucy Byatt, who was an exchange student from Edinburgh, was helping me sew pieces onto the glass, and so I kind of thought you might remember those days, Ingrid. So when Ingrid and Emily had asked me would I write a phrase for the poster, I have to say I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this phrase. Everything I wrote felt like an epithet for a tombstone, and so this really isn't going to work. I guess whenever there's the prospect of a deadline, you all of a sudden realize you've got to come up with an answer, and Emily had sent messages that were more and more urgent, and so finally I just wrote down, I walked a circular path from the Biddle to the anatomical, with short trips to the mathematical, the genital, and the alchemical, keeping faith in the grammatical while avoiding the categorical, ever drawn to the diabolical. It does have a Gilbert and Sullivan overtones to it. I'm aware of that. I wanted to deal with those terms, though, because I actually did think that they do say something about the way I work and where the work comes from. So the Viddle, just in case you were wondering, you don't pronounce the C. It's there, but just ignore it. I've often really been fascinated by the materials of food, the quality of the materials of food. And it's something that I've thought about, and to a large extent I've drawn a lot of ideas for working with materials from how very simple materials in nature work. Eggs, sugar, grapes. For this particular set of images, I had done them for a project for Art Lives, which is a magazine outside of Texas, and I've been invited to do a spread for the magazine, and I wanted to talk about the difference between making grape jam and grape jelly. The difference basically is that most people make grape jelly because they don't know what to do with the skins. The trick is to take the skin off first, boil down the pulp and the seeds, and once all the pits go down to the bottom of the pot, you can sieve out the pits, put the pulp in with the skins, and make grape jam. But the reason I wanted to show you this is that there's something about the relationship between membranes, the membrane over a skin, especially with a slip skin grape, where you can, there are some grapes where you can take them and you can just press them, and just with a little bit of pressure of your fingers, they pop out. Those are called slip skins, and you still get a grape. I mean, the grape is still there. There's still a sense of a membrane. The form there, the grape pit is, the grape seed is floating inside this kind of aqueous indeterminate matter, which is constructed out of sugars, salts, and proteins. And I really find that, to a large extent, whether it's grapes or with eggs or with sugar, they're things that you see every day. They're things that we can imagine. We have a relationship, a direct relationship ourselves. And I've very often been interested in the idea of proposing work where people could imagine they could do it themselves, even if they don't necessarily do it. I know there are other artists that deal with, extraordinarily complicated programming and projections, and megalithic, if not megalomaniacal, constructions, and that's fine, and a lot of times I find them really exciting to look at, but it's not something I want to do. I've often wanted to keep that idea of agency, the ability to be able to act yourselves, and I've found that by going to things like food as a reference is important to me. So, these are all the pulp, the pile of pulp, the skins, the pulp being boiled down, the skins being put back into the pulp. Of course, it turns this beautiful red. And it influences how I think about membranes and construction. This is really useful for somebody who works a lot with molds. In fact, actually teaches a lot of work with molds at UQAM. And so, for instance, with Chloe Desjardins, who's a young artist, I wanted to blow up a set of bicycle tubes. I had made knots with these bicycle tubes, this whole sort of knotty construction, and then to build a mold around these swollen up tubes. You don't need to worry about what the piece looks like right at the moment. I just want you to look at what the mold looks like. What I'm trying to argue for is that kind of Gilbert and Sullivan beginning, actually there's something a bit serious in it too. The anatomical as well, my work has often been linked to artists who are interested in the relationship of the body, the fragility of the body, its permeability, its resistance. And for a number of pieces, I've used my partner, Michel Dagneau, who's a painter, who is an extremely patient man, and puts up with all sorts of things. Generally at 11 o'clock at night, when when all else has been taken care of, he's willing to, let me use his body to draw patterns on. So, for instance, the patterns of the The cloth and silk cloth and sugar pieces I'll show you later were all drawn on his body up with a water-based pastel, and then I would take just silk paper and press it on his body to lift off the pattern, and then transcribe it onto pattern paper. But if you live with another artist, 11 o'clock at night, what happens? You should get silly. And so quite often there's a kind of a theater performance for two that goes on in the studio. It started first by asking him to stand up on the ladder, and well, I mean, sorry, these are just the drawings, but having stood on the ladder, I decided what are other supports. We have these beautiful brass shoe polishing, what people would put the shoes, their feet down on when their shoes polished, and so I said, well, here, balance yourself on that. But there's also this doubling up, because I mean, I've made the pattern from his body, took it off, increased the size of it, then put the prototype back on him and played with it. There's a kind of pixelated version of this where it's kind of a video where I just took lots and lots of pictures, because I'm not really very handy with video cameras, but I know how to take just a picture, and so. But I'm not going to show you that. But the piece was eventually translated into the pattern for one of the pieces I'll show you later. The mathematical, because I said side trips to the mathematical, I have often been interested in those kinds of structures that are linked to the same kinds of relationships there are, for instance, between protein, sugars, and salts in a grape. I'm interested also in the structure, the very simple geometrical structures. I was at l'UQAM. I've been working on with Laurent Pilon, who's a colleague there, on exploring new resins, how to use resins, how to use sort of heterogeneous mixes with resins, and I wanted to, because I'm maybe a little bit more rangé than Laurent, I wanted to have at least some base to work from, and so just built really simple little flexible molds out of what looks like mylar. It's not actually mylar, it's a polyester, but the great advantage is it's transparent, very polished, and resin doesn't stick to it, so you can make all sorts of molds very, very simply without you're building just a membrane, just a construction. It's sort of like an origami construction, and then filling it up. Or not filling it up. One of the things we realized working is that we could just fill one side, one edge, one axis of the piece with one color, turn it, and find a second color, or come up with much more complicated forms and structures. If you happen to have seen the show in Outremont, that was one of the pieces that was there. But there were other kinds of geometry that I really find, I don't know, there's some forms of geometry I find satisfying. Generally things that are linked, for instance, to spirals, where there's a form of geometry, but there's a form of risk within the geometry, and that's one of the things what I always feel about spirals is, you have that idea spinning out of control. It's not something that's constant and measurable. There's a constant set of changes in it. I'm going to show you a performance that I did many, many years ago, and stream. It was when I was in a studio on Clark Street, a building that's no longer there, but was where Galerie Clark was years ago. If you remember Galerie Clark, the reason it was called Clark is it was on Clark. And at the time, I first went to the studio with Eva Brandel, Sorrel Cohen, Susie Lake, Rennie Van Hallen, and John Heward and John Francis were on the other side. Eventually other people came, Landon McKenzie when Susie left, and there was a constant flow of artists there. But in the middle of the studio, for this particular project, I had suspended a large sheet of transparent paper, and tied a rope around the center column and asked my friend Anne Lyons to take a pair of scissors and just carefully cut a spiral out of the paper. And so all that you had was a constant flow of paper and the sound of scissors cutting through the paper. And at the end she comes and might be obvious by now, scissors, rock, paper. She took 2 rocks and broke the scissors apart. So I like that kind of, there's a sense of maybe violence in that geometry, but also that sense of, you know, something losing control. The further you're going away from it, the distances change in a spiral. Sometimes you can have think about geometry, people often think about geometry only in terms of straight lines, but that's not really true. There's a whole set of kind of natural geometry that can be really intriguing. Eventually, for the Quartier des Spectacles, you'll see why I showed just that image. The genital. I've had a very direct and invested interest in the sexual imagery in art, sexual relationships. What kind of ways do 2 bodies come together? How can they come together? This group of pieces, which I had started to do with neoprene gloves, kind of came from 2 ends of my life. I was living in New York at the time. In New York, it was just not possible even to have publicity advertising safe sex at the time of the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And Visual AIDS, which was a group of artists, had organized an exhibition and invited people to propose projects, works for an auction, which was at Paula Cooper. And I proposed 4 pieces. And I'm just going to show you them quickly because they were work that I did with these neoprene gloves, but of course there's this kind of involution that's possible with gloves. A glove can be turned inside out. It maintains its same form, but as well something that is protuberant, one can pull it back in on itself, and what's called an invaginating of form. When you pull, for instance, if you pull your sock off your foot, and you leave it part way through, it's an invaginated form. It's the same form of a sock, but it's turned in on itself. I found this immensely satisfying. This also happened to be at a time when Michelle and I were running a paint company in New York, and we were using those gloves we had a job where we were jeweling a door. You don't need to worry about how to jewel a door. I'll tell you about that another day if you need to know. But you need gloves to protect yourself. And so, I mean, part of it came from just, you know, again, this wasn't necessarily 11 o'clock at night, but 4:30 in the afternoon, I was tired. I started to play with the gloves and realized how beautiful they were, how sexy they were, and I found that quite attractive. And so, and I also realized there was this immense mutability in the forms of the gloves. You know, what it could suggest in terms of orifices, and I've always found that was just one of the most lovely things about the human body. It's just full of orifices. Back to but there's the thing with I was talking about the genital. The other pieces I've done, this was a group of pieces. I mean, I will show you these slides again, just incidentally. This is just part of my first part of my argument. Was made from eggs. I put them in a plastic bag, pulled the air out, made a mold around it, released the pressure, took the eggs out, and then filled the interstices of the bag with in this case, with cement fondue. Cement fondue has a high degree of fidelity to the surface that it's cast in, so it took the form of the eggs, but it also took the form of the plastic as it's negotiating air pressure and the resistance of the eggs. Incidentally, they were hard-boiled eggs. I had the first time I did this, and again, I have to say this is terrible. This was at Francois' studio one more time, and the first time I hadn't thought of hard-boiling the eggs, and they just went right in the vacuum cleaner, right out the vacuum cleaner. I had a terrible time cleaning that up, but anyhow, alchemical. What's the difference between the victual and the alchemical? Well, to a certain extent, the victual in my mind is nature's food when it's not been processed. Alchemical, you know, the stories about alchemistry always seem to involve fire. They always involve state change. You know, it always seems to require burning something to change lead into gold or whatever. And I think I've stretched a bit the sense of alchemical, but I wanted to talk about alchemical because I've had a long relationship with clay. I think that in fact almost all my work, I think of it through the experience I've had with clay. Partly because when clay is at one at the same time a mass, a cold mass for the most part, of wet clay, at the same time it's something that I often think of as being constructed from the inside out. When I work with clay, whether it's figuratively or when I work with making utilitarian objects, I generally work from the inside out. I like the idea of cajoling the clay, sort of teasing the membrane into its form. Even with this piece, for instance, which was not quite the same thing, what I had done was I had bought some fright wigs on Saint Catherine and soaked them in clay slip, and then just carefully brushed all the little curls and the folds and the twists in it, and then worked the body of the piece from the inside out again, so that I wanted it to be a kind of excessive kind of form. But one of the key issues I guess I wanted to say is that clay can go from being cold and wet and flexible and or even just plain sort of a mute, dull mass into something quite precise through fire. And in a parallel way, I've often worked with sugar. I've mentioned sugar before. With cloth, I'd realized at one point that sugar really works as an amazing stiffener of cloth. Over the years, for a number of years, I only did very small pieces, generally silk, because I found at first that the sugar and the silk worked quite well. I could boil up sugar water, soak the cloth in, and then just use the air pressure to create the form. Again, it's just that alchemical idea that something that is a crystal, the change in the crystal, the construction of a crystal they're again conceivable. Every one of us sort of probably knows about leaving a spoon with sugar on it on the kitchen table, not thinking of taking it off and coming back after a long weekend and finding the whole thing is stuck on the table. And so in terms of that kind of idea of alchemistry, whether it's clay, whether it's the sugar and the cloth, or even cement, the kinds of movement of cement, how it sets. I'm really interested in how it's often sort of like almost baking bread. You can see that it sets up a kind of crust on one edge, and you can decide to maintain that crust or not. For instance, with these pieces, which are silk forms filled with cement, or plastic forms filled with cement, there's just this whole range of the cement leaking through. I kind of like the leaks through, the kind of the brown stains through. More recently, I've looked at the same questions in terms of resins, again with Laurent Pilon at l'UQAM, with these hood form pieces that they're not finished. I'm showing you, for the most part, maquettes. But how can you get that kind of transition, that kind of indeterminate matter. With the diabolical, when I've been looking at the relationship, for instance, I talked about the sexual relationship between two people, but even our interpersonal relationships, I've often felt that one of the things that we need, that I've wanted to always recognize, is that conflict is a standard. There's always going to be conflict, and it's not necessarily a disaster if there's a certain degree of tension. The question is how well you negotiate it. But you don't have to necessarily. I mention this because we're in a university where there's often a huge need for everybody to feel good about each other, and it's a lovely thing to feel good about each other, but it's also possible to disagree with people and still deal with them cordially. You know, you can just say, no, I don't agree, that's just not it, or I really don't agree, but still we can work together. Anyhow, there's a kind of sense of how life is that I don't consider myself a cynical person, but I do think that there's a form of aggression that one needs to recognize, and a kind of sense of horror, maybe diabolical. I was pushing the envelope a bit by using the word diabolical, but for instance, the image of a dead cat on a gravel road, a piece that I showed at Clark, it's one of the few times that I've used a lot of anything. I don't know. You'll see throughout my work that I very seldom worked with accumulated objects, but this is maybe one time the safety pins. They were soldered together. I just wanted to have a kind of veil form of the pins. I wanted the kind of beauty and delicacy and also violence of the pins, and also the kind of delicacy in the shadows that it cast. Another kind of form of diabolical might be the movement kind of towards a mask, or the reversal of forms. This large head in Bengaline silk is just held together, or is formed just partly by the air pressure pushing it out, but also by colored, very silk threads that are crisscrossing the piece and pulling it in. And I've often felt that there was a real sense of tension in that piece, and I've often been very attracted to works that have a real sense of tension within them, that there's a sense of risk in them. So now I'd like to start over again. That was for the introduction. I thought I better be clear. There's some things that I don't really do. You'll notice as I go along. I don't generally do derision, for instance. I understand it, but it's not generally violence, maybe, but derision, no. In terms, someone was asking me, are these all a lot of my work installations? Actually, I don't usually call those pieces installations. I've never felt 100% comfortable with the term. I think other people do that quite well again. But the kind of self-specific aspect of installations where you kind of respond to the site, I very seldom do that. My work can go from one place to another. And for the most part, I've tried to keep the tension between the pieces themselves and not actually between the pieces and the space they're in. So I wanted to come back to this piece because I talked about it, about geometry and a spiral and being cut out and moving, how she cuts and moves away from the center. But in fact, it is based on a child's game, and at the same time, it does seem to have a kind of larger story about that tension, violence, and forces, competing forces. It's probably not also separate from the fact that Anne Lyons, who was the person I asked to do it, was a very close friend of mine. It was a very, we had a long history together, and generally don't find myself in my own performances, if I can call them performances. I'm actually not 100% sure that's what I actually do. I like setting up situations where somebody else does it. I kind of think of them as yet another working element, but it's very seldom that you see me there. In fact, you just don't see me there. For the pieces that I had shown in that show for visual aids, eventually I worked out a group of pieces from that, of 8 pieces. They were, the first group were always a left hand and a right hand. They were simply the gloves filled with, or held together with an armature, and then filled with hydrocalyx, which is kind of a fancy plaster, if you will. And so they held their forms. There was kind of smoothness, elegance. They're very clean and sharp, but they're also black and a synthetic rubber. There's a weight to synthetic rubber. There's even a smell to it that I find quite attractive with them. And there's a kind of sense of menace in them that I feel is important to recognize. They sit there. The first group were both sort of like 2 full pieces. The second group were a bit different in the sense that there was always a full and an empty piece. There was always a sense of sort of like a hand and a glove. You know, there was one that was always supporting the other, a kind of floating lightness, where the weight of the rubber is actually the subject. Following those pieces, I had also thought more about how far can you push that tension. I mean, setting up a situation where things are at risk. These pieces are made out of organza silk. They're filled with sand. They weigh each of them a couple of kilos. There is a kind of, silk is amazingly strong, but there's also a limit to silk too. And these pieces do, in fact, survive just because I realized how to work the seams. I mean, basically, I realized that I couldn't just use a straight seam, that I would have to double up the seams. Sometimes they're a French seam, sometimes they're, I'm not sure what all the terms are in English anymore, but either way, I mean, sometimes they're like this and sometimes they go like this. So to distribute the weight through the pieces. There is no armature in them. They're kind of the 2 meetings of 2 weak materials. The silk has no shape or form in itself, except that I've cut it in a pattern. But it doesn't stand up on its own, and neither does the sand. But the 2 of them together do resist. And you can even have, or I can have, in fact, the whole this weight of this whole piece hanging from the shelf, and just the sort of the feeding hole at the top for filling in the sand. The furniture varied from one exhibition to another. I simply didn't keep the same furniture. I did show these in a number of places in Europe and in America and in Canada, and I would simply ship the little bags and a little envelope, pick up the sand and wherever I was going to be, and then went out looking for furniture. For instance, this one has gone on different pieces, but I've always been able to find something that had a kind of arm-like shape in the furniture, and then just pulled the arm. I mean, basically, it's full of sand, but if I lift it and pull it and sort of stroke it into form, it holds its form. So there's a kind of, that's what I was trying to say when I was talking earlier about that kind of tension within the piece, the sense of risk. The same thing with the piece that's in the middle here. You have to sort of pull it forward. It means a constant caring for it. It's a little bit like a garden. You can't just sort of leave it there. And thank goodness those pieces were purchased by the National Gallery, who has a whole team of people who are quite willing to sort of cajole and nudge the pieces into place, and that's really good. If I'd really thought about the whole thing, I might not have done it. But anyhow, it's done now. This question of sort of weight that was in those pieces with the sand, and the kind of weight that was in the gloves with the plaster, I had a real need to kind of set something up in contradistinction to those very heavy pieces, and it's when I first started using the sugar and the silk pieces and bringing them together. So this is at the Crédac in Paris. There's a number of these pieces, as I said, where I had just got these large plastic bags, filled them with eggs, hard-boiled eggs, pulled the air out. I would form the piece once I decided that I was happy with the shape of it, you know, with this vacuum cleaner running constantly, holding the pressure, keeping, you know, the plastic around the eggs. Because there's no shape to the eggs on, you know, a whole group of eggs. They don't have a shape on their own. They just have the shape that's given them by the pressure of the vacuum cleaner pulling on them. Made the mold and then cast most of them just with cement, but some of them, for instance this one here, I'd also made these clay eggs that I'd glazed kind of great Anthelma blues of, you know, that I would think of, you know, for a teacup or something, and filled those in with the eggs. And so all of them have a real sense of weight. They also have this real sense of delicacy because the plastic was so thin. I really used dry cleaner plastic, so you can tell that it's thin plastic. You can tell that each little fold is tight, nervous, and kind of agitated. And I like that tension between something that is huge, well, not really huge, but relatively huge. I mean, bigger than me anyhow. And these delicate folds and twists and of a plastic surface. I also showed some of these pieces in Valenciennes in the north of France, and showed for the first time the glass piece here, which was the piece that you had seen earlier when I was doing here at Concordia. It was just a sheet of glass, holes had been drilled in it. We sewed these plastic forms on these two circles. I'd heated up the plastic so that I could just stick my finger in. I created kind of a nipple form. I called it Agathe for Saint Agathe. If you know the painting by Zurbaran of Saint Agathe holding in her hand what looked like two pastries, and they're not pastries. They're her breasts, and it was the martyrdom of Saint Agathe. The other pieces, in fact, all the glass pieces are named after saints. The vacuum cleaners here in the center are not running. They were the vacuum cleaners I used for blowing up these small silk pieces. Again, they were about involuted forms. The red one is just a little boy's jacket where I sewed the lining, I sewed the jacket, but I didn't attach the lining to the jacket at this line here. So consequently, when the air pressure went, it pulled the arms out, the lining of the arms out, popped them out, which is the red here, and the other part goes out the back there. So I started to realize that I could also play with the limits of things. For instance, not sew the whole shirt. For instance, just baste the shirt, or leave the basting and the pins in, and so there'd be tension between the pins, the sugar, the material. They were all. I realized that you could get away with a fair bit given the strength of sugar. The question of, I was also interested in what kind of quality of sugar. I mean, this seems kind of an odd thing, but you can make the sugar disappear, you can make it sit on the surface. I'm showing you this slide because it's particularly clear that the sugar can sit and sort of crystallize on the surface if you charge it with too much sugar, or if you decide to sort of rework the piece afterwards. Again here, there's a kind of, crust on it. but you can also pull back. One of the things, though, that I wasn't able to do for the longest time was to do large pieces. I couldn't figure out how to do heavier materials than Dupioni silk. For some reason, I seemed to always get stuck there. And I kept thinking, well, I got to add more and more sugar, so I try heavier and heavier materials and try and make the syrup heavier. And in fact, that turned out not to be the answer. The answer turned out to be exactly the opposite, which was to reduce the syrup, reduce the density of the syrup, so that there was actually less sugar in it, because it didn't need as much sugar. Because in fact, the heavier materials are woven, you know, so that there's some more fibers going in different directions. So that in fact, it was the opposite of what I thought it was going to be. But in a way, I was actually quite, although I wish I'd figured it out sooner, I was really attracted by that realization that there's, how can I say this, there is a kind of intelligence in materials, and I'm very interested in that kind of intelligence of materials. Here's the Saint Agathe piece that was shown. This was this is in Bassivière. I also had pulled the plastic down. I didn't remove the mold, because the mold is just these two sheets of plastic right on each side of the glass. On the one side, I didn't remove it at all, and on the other side, I just cut it back and let it hang down. So it's just a bit of plastic hanging down that's a bit dirty, and I don't want it to be cleaned. I want it to stay there. I like that the kind of elegance, but also the kind of smut to it. I don't know whether it's more visible here. You can see that there's just the traces of the cement fondue that's left over. It is, I don't know if I mentioned this, it's cement fondue, which is just a lovely material to work with. This is the large egg piece. And these are just close-ups of the same pieces. For those of you who work in ceramics, you may recognize when you, a lot of times with clay, people think of clay as something that you model and work directly, but also it's also something that you can cast. Clay needs to be cast in a plaster that's relatively a weak plaster. Sulo, or plaster that's not. It has more water in it when you mix it than when you use a regular plaster, and it's so that it'll absorb the water of the clay slip. And I've always thought they were so beautiful. Like when you pour the clay slip into a mold, and then there's this sort of thing where the clay slip bubbles up over the edge, and it makes this lovely sort of chocolatey, or generally chocolatey, it might be vanilla-y if it's a white slip, but anyhow, it makes this lovely kind of lip on the edge. And so this piece in the front is just basically a gigantic mold where I just poured in the clay slips, and so it has this kind of city structure to it in the plaster, and then I just presented the piece with the clay sitting up on the edges. Again, it was something that I just found, it confirmed something I felt about life, that, you know, that something could be very pristine, but also that it would have this kind of, these little, in this case, kind of chocolate traces. And again, the same group of pieces. This piece, which is called Cause des Systèmes, is kind of a conversational piece. Again, it was, to a certain extent, it's kind of an homage to conversations that I've had with Michelle in the studio about systems and the way things work. But it's also the kind of tension between the kind of Euclidean geometry and a fractal geometry between Dupioni silk and polyester. It's maybe not something a lot of people know, but polyester does react to air pressure differently than the Dupioni silk, and I was kind of interested to realize that, and just set up this little, kind of little experiment piece of the two together, and they're just sitting there one beside the other. I talked to you about the cement pieces earlier when I was talking about those kind of alchemical relationships between materials. And this slide, I think, will give you maybe a better idea of what I'm talking about. This one is just a slightly different polyester than the other ones that I used. And so what happened is when I filled it up with cement, the cement came up through the material and set up this beautiful crust. It was very, very hard and very resistant. And so it's like the polyester is almost no longer there. It's all cement on the outside, or you could just see a few traces of polyester. But I liked how the material, I hadn't expected it to happen, but when it did happen, I really was very happy with that piece, because I liked how there was this movement of it. It lifted up over the surface, formed this dense crust, and it had a kind of, to me, it had a kind of an intelligence of its own. It had a structure of its own that I found really appealing. I don't know if you can see, but there's a kind of sense of rivulets of the water, also from the cement, that left traces on the outside of the piece. Whereas with this silk, that's not at all what happened. It was in the orifices, the cement left traces, but otherwise it stayed all within the silk, partly because I'm guessing the silk was probably
Weighted, yeah.
No, empesé is starched. 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 It was probably starched. And so it probably didn't let the cement go through. Then I kind of, with these pieces, I wanted to get back to kind of the anatomical, meeting a little bit the genital. I had already a show in progress at Optica. This is the space at Optica, and actually I got very, very ill. I had a dissected carotid artery, to be more precise. It was really something that really hurts like hell, and you're not in good condition. So I had done 2 large pieces, but I hadn't planned on a third large piece, which I just couldn't handle. And I also wanted to get back to making things that weren't necessarily really big and complicated. And so I started working on these small figures. I used a basalt clay. A basalt clay is basically Josiah Wedgwood clay, a black clay that I underfired. This is not the color it's supposed to be, but I kind of like it underfired. It has to me it has the quality of, let's say, rye bread at its very best. And I felt that it was really, even though that's not really quite the color of my skin, I felt that it had the feeling of skin. It had that kind of differentiated surface of skin, where the salts, for instance, come up through the clay. It's a clay that's very sensitive to any soluble salts when you're working with it, and so when it's fired at its to its maturity, it gets a nice deep black color and almost kind of a sheen to it. But when it's underfired, as it is here, you get this kind of odd sense of almost like the bloom on top of chocolates that have been put in the refrigerator. The question of membranes, of course, is the same thing with the underwear on his head. It is a membrane. It's something you can play with. I think playing with was probably a theme that I hadn't quite recognized with the piece when I did it, but certainly they are. It's kind of embarrassing to say, but they are a portrait of my adolescence. I just was amazed at the potential of clothing to keep me amused. And into my own potential to keep myself amused. It was just an unbelievable store of things to consider. And I had kind of as a partner while I was working on this, a cat was living in our house. We had, Francine Degenet was living actually at our place, and her cat Anonymous spent the most inordinate amount of time cleaning itself, and I thought there was this kind of self-possession that I also found quite appealing. So there were a whole group of pieces of Anonyma cleaning herself. The pieces that actually I had, this was one piece that I had proposed for, I did show it Optica, but my original idea had been 3 swing sets. And as I said, I had done 2, I didn't do the third because I had this dissected carotid artery, but I did show this piece. This was one of them, it was a swing past progressive. My dad had made us a swing set when I was a kid. I have to say, when I was a kid, I don't actually remember when I did learn how to weld, because I learned quite early how to weld, and we didn't have like a store-bought swing set. We had one that my father had welded together with recuperated pipes. And my sisters and I would build sort of like snow structures on top of the swing set, and I also remember that in the winter with the wind blowing, that it would actually freeze. The water would freeze, and the swing would freeze, and it wouldn't be hanging down; it would be freezing on a slight angle. And again, that kind of potential of water to hold a structure, that kind of alchemical appeal. I decided to work on. So these are the somewhat exaggerated versions of what the swing did or didn't do. These photographs are not at Optica. That floor is beautiful and belongs to the Musée d'Art Contemporain. But at the time it was shown at Optica. And then I couldn't resist this kind of little nipple construction. But I very much like the empty space. For me, I worked quite a lot at figuring out how to keep that, here, I'll just show you, maybe it's more clear here, that empty part. I wanted to dip down and come back up again. I just wanted that, all the tension to be there. The second swing was this one, which is not a terribly good image, and took out the other 2 images because I realized that I had accidentally scan them at the wrong level, so you can't see them, but they are, it's just it's cast colored hydrocal, where I had just drilled, actually I didn't, Diane Morin did, drilled hundreds and hundreds of little holes in the PVC tubes that I used as a mold, and then we just wiped one color of hydrocal in it, then another color on top of it. And again, I wanted to have a kind of empty space, and I mean, it's just a lot of technical problems to come up with something where it's empty and intention, but also straight, but it can be done. After that, I will just show you really quickly some pieces that I had done in Toronto Sculpture Garden, because I wanted to get to a group of pieces that I showed here in Montreal in front of the on l'Île Sainte-Hélène. They were for an exhibition artifact. They were in clay. With these pieces, it was at the 50th anniversary of Expo 67. That really was a remarkable experience. When we left Scarborough, Ontario, to come and visit Montreal, which was just such an amazing city and such an amazing experience. We were in awe of Montreal and Expo 67, and I still and I wanted to have that sense of sort of a grandeur or a sweep of energy with these pieces. I remember thinking the Jacques Cartier Bridge was just the summum of construction. I don't know why, but I really liked the Jacques Cartier Bridge, and so that kind of sweep up. I was also very attracted to the subway. You know, I mean, Toronto has a lovely subway, but it's just the colors weren't at all the same thing. When I came and I saw the Peel subway, I thought it was just beyond all belief. The ceramic, the color, the glazes. Truly, this may sound odd to you because you probably look at it and think it's very désuet. It's very you know, old-fashioned, but it still actually really touches me. I look at those glazed panels and I'm quite attracted to them. Again, I showed you this image in terms of alchemistry. This is just a cement fondue disc. Again, I had just made it by taking a sheet of plastic, scoring the plastic on one side, a circle on one side, a circle on the other, and reversing the circles, and then just folding them. And again, a little bit like origami, casting it with the cement. But what I did is I then cast a membrane behind it so that I had blocked air passages in all the cement pieces, so that it would be cement that floats. Of course, cement floats. But I mean, our first thought is that cement doesn't float. But I mean, boats are made out of steel and they float too. You just need to capture the air for them to stay in place. Back to the cat, dead cat on the gravel road. I guess the questions of for me that was interesting for these pieces is how something can be just a veil. How can it can be a veil is kind of like a membrane, but it's just sitting on the edge. It's almost not a form. It's only half of a cat. Part of the reason we read it as a form is because of the shadows, but it's all open on the underneath part. I like that idea of just getting sort of the liminal cat, and also hoping that the shadows are going to work just fine, and then they work reasonably well. A second piece I did was a kind of a cat fight, and I have to say that with this one the shadows didn't work as well. I moved it into the center of the room. I really liked how I liked the base a lot. I like lifting it up. I'm not convinced that it worked as well, just because I didn't have a wall to work it against. So sometimes it's interesting to see what happens when it doesn't work too. I haven't always worked on images myself, although I do have to say that I'm a willing model when Michelle is not. But every once in a while I've worked from images of my youth. My sister Anne is somebody that I find easy to remember. I remember her gestures quite well, and so she's often been a subject, but also guys I went to high school with. I have these memories that are so precise about gestures, about arms hanging down, and it's just amazing. It's just been etched in my mind. So I decided to present a number of these pieces with these cats. Again, they were a bit different. These cats were made out of porcelain, much like the other one that I showed you. I soaked fright wigs in clay slip. Although these ones are a bit different in the sense that I had modeled the cats and then added the fright wigs on top of the clay, which is different than the red one where I had showed you where I had actually worked the fur from the inside out. I think you can feel the difference. I don't know whether you can tell, but the forms are different. This one, you can feel it's kind of been placed. With this piece, I mean, as I said, I was quite amazed at the potential of clothing to keep me amused, but even basement floors in the summer, I would go down and take my clothes off and press my body against the cold floor. I mean, partly because it was excessively hot in Scarborough. And it was an excuse to take my clothes off, I guess, I don't know. But it wasn't necessarily that I was up to really no good, but just I know that I would do things like lift one leg and just feel what one leg felt like. Now that is actually a very simple thing for somebody to do. It's not necessarily simple to do in clay. How to get one long leg holding up, I don't know if you can see, but the second leg, the one further away from you, is not touching the glass sheet. It actually required a lot of fiddling to do. There's a kind of armature running down the middle of the leg so that it would hold up. And obviously we constructed with the same clay, we covered the same clay with tissue so that it would shrink at the same rate as the piece would shrink during the firing, so that there wouldn't be a tension between the two of them. So he has just one leg lifted, and I wanted it to be very simple, just one leg lifted, and then this kind of odd gesture of having his hands on his shoulders. Also, you know, the relationship of the toilet. You know, it's often the images in our history of women taking a bath, but I was interested in an image of myself, you know, washing myself. And of course, I mean, you know, I did have to decide he was going to be washing his butt. But I kind of liked the double thing of, yes, he's washing himself, it's a tail. He was actually kind of a double self-portrait. There was a guy I went to school with, Brian, who had red hair, and I was always amazed because his skin was sort of the same kind of reddish tone as his hair. It was sort of like he was more naked than most people were naked, you know, like, because it was kind of like I had this feeling that, you know, his hair was almost like translucent, and so he was kind of the source for that. And this piece is again a bit different. It's actually a portrait of my dad, who's a very sweet man, a very loving man. But I didn't want to have him holding a child, but I wanted some sort of sense of paternity, that sense of, you know, what he must feel as a father. And so I just made these silk balloons for him to be holding. I wanted them to be beautiful, but I didn't want him to have a baby, or it was funny, there was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there were a whole lot of ads of young guys holding babies. There was a time when you just couldn't see, they were everywhere. And I'm sure it had something to do with new images of masculinity, and I'm not too sure what it was, but I think that also was something that was behind my thinking. This is actually a good example of the basalt clay fired to maturity. I remember saying to you that when it's fired to maturity, it gets this kind of sheen to it, and it's much, much darker. This was another guy I went to high school with, Charles White. He was black, and his name was Charles White, which that was perfect, because we also had a Doug Black, who turned out that he was white. So we had Doug Black and Charles White. But he was tall, and he had the most extravagant gestures, and I mean, really, with his hands and everything. But nobody would say anything, because I mean, we were just terrorized at him. He was just really impressive, because he was from the States. We were from Scarborough, you know. He obviously knew what was going on, and so we just thought, sure, fine. But yeah. And those are kind of the last of the pieces that I want to show you that are with clay, but these ones I guess I wanted to show you them because I liked how the glaze sat on the clay. I wanted it to just break slightly. It's the same dark basalt body. It's just a white glaze, a shiny glaze, but applied very thinly. I wanted it to just be sort of that kind of sense of a membrane being translucent or permeable. I'll just show you a couple of other images of some public art pieces, and then I just will. This was an installation that I did for l'École de Bois Franc in Ville Saint-Laurent. It's a group of 14 children cast in 2 colors of hydrocal. They basically, it was just a really simple thing. I took the same mold, cast the piece twice with 2 different colors of hydrocal, and just turned the position of the bodies so that they're in different positions. I've always been interested in that piece by Rodin called The Shades. I don't know if you know it. It's sort of 3 women moving in towards the center. It wasn't until 1971 that somebody, Elgin, who's an art historian, realized that in fact they were actually all the same figure. It was just because they were sitting on one leg, a different leg, that people didn't. They always thought they were 3 separate figures, but it was just the same figure, just moved in different positions. The last group of pieces I wanted to show you are the cloth and sugar pieces. Well, as I said, when I finally realized that I had to just had to reduce the amount of sugar in the syrup to do large pieces, I decided to work from cloth that I got from Michel's mum's house. His mum had died, but she'd saved all these, the clothes of her. She had 7 kids, and most of them were boys, and she bought always the same thing for all the brothers, and so there was lots of different size jackets, different size pants, all organized and all carefully cleaned. And so the piece where I started, where I showed you me tracing on Michel, started from this. I started with the cloth from his parents' place. I didn't stick to that, but that was the initial piece that I did. These were also jackets and suit jackets that she had sewn. And his brother, a hockey player, J.J. Dagneau, had tons of hockey uniforms, as did his brother Pierre, who also was a hockey player. Michel had politely given me the jackets of the Montreal Canadiens until his brother found out that they were always going to chop them up and soak them in sugar water, whereupon I was given the minor league jackets, which is what you have here. These are the minor league jackets. I'm just showing you, probably just give a sense of how the piece is blown up. It does require a bit of science to figure out how to get the airflow going evenly. It's not that you can't blow it up, but you need to blow it up evenly. And because the jackets are almost all polyester, you've got to be fairly, it's sort of one of these things you've got to get it done and over with. The piece that what I was showing you when you were first coming in was a performance that I did in Barjol, where I'd asked these kids to carry this large figure that's made out of fake suede, actually. It's 17 feet long, and this is not soaked in sugar water. It's soaked in rabbit skin glue. And I had blown the piece up here in the studio in Barjol. Barjol is an art center in the southeast of France. To do the piece, it's all soaked in the rabbit skin glue. The panel in there's a plastic panel that I use in order to have a place for the children to carry the piece, and so the plastic is removed once the piece is completely set. Oh, there's an image that I just put in here to. This is a different piece in our house in Saint-Amand-de-Verre in France, but the figure, when I shipped the figure to Barjol, I shipped it in a suitcase, and it had to come back in a suitcase as well. And so I made a little figure of him in. You see what I'm drawing? I'm showing you. It's just a small figure of him. I drew the front and the back of him, glued them together, and then showed the people in Barjol how to fold him up so that he would fit into the suitcase. And but of course here he's now out of the suitcase. He's blown up and suspended. And here we're lifting him down from the studio for the performance. And what you saw was the black and white version. I'm now giving you the version in color. What I did is I asked the kids to carry him through Barjol. It's a city that has lots of fountains, and I wanted them to, and so I made for them various hats and masks and gloves. And they were all, the hats and the gloves were made with sugar, but he was made with rabbit skin glue. And I wanted them to walk through the town to the top of the town, and then as they came from one fountain to another, to take off one item of the parade and wash it in one of the fountains, and then we'd remove it so that we keep coming down until we came to the last fountain where he would be washed and melt down. Now, we had done it twice. The first time we did it, we had quite a range of small children. I had this image of sort of children carrying this large figure through the town, but when they were told finally that I was going to film it, only the girls showed up. And at that, they tended to be the older girls, but none of the little boys who had been there before wanted to do it then. All of a sudden they thought, oh no, they weren't going to have anything to do with that. So it kind of took on a different feeling, because I mean, they were a significantly older group, sort of young, sort of pre-adolescent girls. But it did have a different feeling, and I was kind of interested. This girl was really quite interested that she decided to wear a T-shirt with a skull on the front of it. But there was this. I guess it was kind of to me the fact that there were young girls and they were carrying this sort of gigantic hero figure. He's 17 foot man, had a very odd tension that I found quite intriguing. When they came to the end, the largest fountain, then they gradually lowered the piece into the fountain and just slowly washed him till he softened and melted, and we just ended the performance there. The last pieces I just want to show you are the last group of pieces that I've been working on are of heads. Again, sort of those involuted forms, a bit like the gloves, the idea of forms coming in on themselves. This fabric is a fabric that is woven green on the outside and pink on the inside, so that when you make a seam, the seam is green. It's a green line on the pink. The mouth is green, as you can see here. I'll just show you. When if the throat accidentally one time popped out of its moorings, as it were, and became sort of like a gigantic tongue, but it was really supposed to go the other way. So what I did is I blew it up one direction, and then I take the vacuum cleaner and blow it up the other, so that I kind of like, also there's this equivalency. You can change the direction of the air and the tension on the piece. Back to the Bengaline silk, what I was saying to you earlier was that it's formed partly by the pressure of the air pushing outwards. It's an extremely thin silk. It's kind of woven like a corduroy. And I just found this tail end of a bolt. It's just sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of like Melba toast, sort of dry, crackly kind of silk. It's hard to really describe. But what I had wanted to do was just to form the face by using pulling on these cords and tying it to the buttons, so that it would pull and there'd be this tension. It's not that easy to see in the slide, but you can sort of see that there are cords holding the piece together. And the last piece I want to show you is Sailor's Delight. It's what we used for the poster. It's again a piece that there's a question of sort of material in it, in the sense that I used it's broadcloth with a kind of chintz pattern on it that Michelle's mum had used for covering a sofa and pillowcases. And what I liked was the opposite side, the wrong side of the material. I liked kind of how the pattern was softened and the colors were softened by that. So I sewed the piece with the inside of the print on the outside. It's broadcloth, so a huge amount of air was coming through it. So it was something that I had to sort of keep soaking over and over again. The arms are threaded through the body and sort of leap out through the chest. I kind of like again, there's an ambiguity between the kind of a prayer position of hands in prayer and a kind of, you know, something transpiercing the breast. Anyhow, it's the piece that I decided to end the talk at. So there you have it. That's it.
Open it up for some questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to ask you a question that is more about process.
Yeah.
I feel that there's a lot of drawing within some of the pieces, through
Yeah.
the pipes, the drawing of the body,
Yeah.
and the threads. So I was wondering if there's a process involved with drawing and sculpture and the relationship.
I actually draw a lot. I don't usually use drawings as a prefiguration of a piece. Often they're accompanying a piece. Drawings often go along with my pieces. I had said to Ingrid, I had hesitated a while about showing drawings as well. But I just thought if I started showing you all that, it would just probably be too much. There is kind of a nod to drawing in the web poster. I don't know whether you saw the web poster, the pattern on the wall. But certainly drawing, I think, is important, particularly with the cloth pieces, because they're flat membranes, and yet they're cut so that they form a three-dimensional form. I mean, I really do find it quite interesting, those questions that a tailor or a dressmaker has to consider. If, you know, do I cut something on the bias? How do I cut a curve so that two curves meet and they create another form? I've never been, you know, like properly trained in dressmaking, but I have a very good friend in Jashiki Hiroshi who's worked with designers like Mary McFadden and I'm going to forget his name. All of a sudden, anyhow, he's taught me a lot about how you can make get a two-dimensional surface to meet a three-dimensional, create a three-dimensional form. And so, yeah, drawing is quite important to me, because I look at, I was saying, even with clay, I think of it as a membrane. I don't think of it as a block of material. And in that sense, I think of its limits and how two things can come together. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, mostly in the earlier part of your talk, the way you represent the human body, I saw it as more, you know, humankind and showing qualities like weight and positive, negative space and qualities that are shared by people. So my question was going to be, I was wondering if your ideas come from personal experience, where they came from. But then later you showed work that directly did come from personal experience. But overall, I'm just wondering where your ideas start. Is it from personal experience or other things?
Well, personal experience could be sort of the psychological experience, which is sort of the way you've asked your question. I think maybe that's what you mean. But often it's the experience of materials. It's just that what I was trying to say about, for instance, the pleasure I had playing with the gloves on a job site. I do project to a certain extent a kind of almost kind of ethical quality to the relationships between parts, or the ability of a weak material to resist a strong material. I think if I've often talked about the idea of risk in materials, or risk in work, it's because I do think that it relates to a larger experience I've had of life, you know, that Antonio Guzman once wrote about my work, talking about how he found that it constantly refers to the conditional tense, you know, si je peux le dire ainsi, you know, if I could say it this way, if I could say it that way. He sees them almost as a series of propositions. And I think probably the most important element is that kind of experience, but not necessarily I was in a place and something happened. It's not that kind of, necessarily that kind of experience, but much more of my experience of materials confirms a vision I have of life. I think that's as close as a coherent answer as I could come up with. Yeah?
Just had a question, partially regarding, I guess, a conceptual framework in relationship to the materials that you're using.
Yeah.
I was wondering what part perhaps art historical referencing, such as, I was looking at the fact that you're using rabbit skin glue, or you're using these kind of sugar. Mm-hmm. For me, it reminded me a lot of the kind of Spanish Baroque, the sculptures where they're using the really stiffened fabrics in the sculptures, the wood sculptures. Mm-hmm. And then I also, looking at this final slide, slides that you showed of the kind of procession. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of interested in this relationship that I see regarding.
I love art history. Actually, I really, really love looking at art. I don't think. I don't know whether any of you went to the talk of Georges Huberman at l'UQAM last week. Did anyone go? Incidentally, it was a fabulous talk. He talked about a series of letters between Godard and Pasolini, and it's terrible. Now I'm going to try and explain to you what a very brilliant man this said, but I'll try and say it quickly. Godard and Pasolini both are filmmakers. At the same time, they have a correspondence. They kind of like what each other are doing, but they're critical of each other. In fact, they're downright nasty when it comes down to it, but it's really very entertaining letters. And Godard was always working on this idea that film was a new language, and it had to break with all previous language, and it had to cut all bounds and always push the language of cinema forward. His great criticism of Pasolini was that Pasolini would keep looking back to history, and he would use the Gospel of St. Matthew, he would use the Decameron, he would use Arabian Nights, and he found this to be, conservative to the extreme. I have to say I have a great deal of sympathy for Pasolini, because I think, why shouldn't it be ours? Why should that not belong to us? When maybe a different way of I just thought of another thing I can tell you that relates to your question. It's a good question. I was teaching, I only taught about 3 courses at a school called Hofstra, District 65 in New York. For the most part, the students are from District 65. This is AFL-CIO union. And Hofstra is not actually a university, it's normally in New York City, but this was their outreach because it was an excessively white university in Long Island, and they wanted to kind of work out their numbers, and so they opened up something where they could have, all of a sudden have a lot of Black and Puerto Rican students basically in their school. And I was teaching, and I was, there was a show of Canova at the Met, and there's Pauline Borghese, the first time in America. Pauline Borghese, I don't really know this sculpture, but it's a very white marble. Pauline Borghese, sort of stretched out like Madame Recamier to a certain extent. And, so I said, white marble, Eurocentric, and I came up with something that I thought was the right thing to say to my students, except when we went to visit it, they said, well, wow, I love that marble. Like, why shouldn't we love that marble? It's a material. And it was a revelation to me. I thought, it's right. There are connotations to materials, but we don't necessarily, we can reread history. We can take out what we want from it. I mean, I used the word agency before, and I don't see history as something that happened by somebody else, or I do feel that I'm an agent. I can decide that I will draw out from European history or Japanese art history or Indian or African art, whatever, and I would expect the same thing. I think we can afford it ourselves, and we can afford others that ability to act, to be an agent with art history. So yeah, actually, I really do look at art history. I don't see it as something that I want to cut myself off from. And I don't feel it's a weight either. I don't think it has to be.
Are those letters published, the Pasolini?
Yes. Yeah, well, yeah, they were published in two cinema journals. I mean, they were published. Just that Georges Duhamel decided to actually analyze them, and I mean, it was just an excellent conference. Yeah. Any other questions?
Actually, I had a question.
Yeah.
The last thing you said led really well into it. I was wondering if you think about your work as being political. Like, does it come from that place at all for you? I know that anybody else can read anything into anything, but for you personally.
Well, I mean, I would say for the most part, no. I think of myself as a political person, but I don't feel the obligation to be efficient about it. I mean, I think sometimes, if I have to say that there's something that kind of drives me crazy about Canadian thinking at times, is this idea of being efficient about everything, and sort of like, if I have a political position, I better get it into my work. I'm just a very inefficient political creature, and so I'm really involved. I mean, I can get quite involved in different things, but not. I just don't necessarily pull the two of them together.
I didn't mean that to be like a leading question. I was
that's
genuinely
fine.
wondering.
It's fine. I think I think that. There are ways my work obviously must resonate politically. If I've talked about conflict the way I've talked about conflict, or I've talked about resistance or weak materials, but that's not, my politics will tend to be much more into distributing postcards for a cause, or writing members of parliament, or my time carrying posters, for various causes. But I sort of, in my case, I see this as something else. I'm not efficient about it. Any others? Well, thank you so much. And,